You're all very welcome to our conversation about, I suppose, one of the most legendary events of the history of Kilmainham Gaol, which sees its centenary this year, the escape of three men sometime before 9 p.m. on the 14th of February 1921. Those three men were Ernie O'Malley, Frank Teeling, and Simon Donnelly. A fourth man, Patrick Moran, who'd been involved in the planning for this escape, decided to stay behind with tragic consequences. And we'll be hearing a lot more about his story later on in the conversation. They managed to escape with the help of their comrades in the IRA outside the wall, but vital to this escape was also the collusion, and certainly in at least one case, the active assistance of some of the British soldiers who were guarding them in Kilmainham Gaol at the time. Kilmainham was in a funny stage of its history, I suppose, at that time. It was both a billet, a garrison. There were soldiers living in the jail in one half in the east wing, and also a military prison in the west wing, in the older part of the jail. So joining me for this conversation, we have three distinguished speakers and experts in this area. First of all, I just want to welcome May Moran. May is the niece of Patrick Moran and is the author of Executed for Ireland, The Patrick Moran Story. Having lived in London and Dublin, she returned to Roscommon in 1980. She was a primary school teacher in the Convent of Mercy in Boyle until she retired in 2008. And she lives next door to Patrick Moran's ancestral home. So I suppose living in the shadow of his memory, quite literally. Our other speaker is Dr. William Murphy, who's a lecturer in the School of History and Geography in DCU. His primary field of research is modern Irish history, in particular the history of the Irish Revolutionary period. And to date, this work has centered on three key areas: the history of political imprisonment, the history of sport and leisure, and the history of female suffragism. Among his publications is Political Imprisonment and the Irish, 1912 to 1921, which was published by the Oxford University Press in 2014. And joining us from his home in Connecticut in the United States is Cormac O'Malley, the son of Ernie O'Malley, who Ernie O'Malley, of course, is the author of a number of autobiographical memoirs from at the period of the Troubles in the 1920s, including On Another Man's Wound and The Singing Flame. He was also a military historian and a militant nationalist from 1916 to 24. Cormac's mother was the sculptor and photographer Helen Hooker, who was from Connecticut. Cormac was formerly an international corporate lawyer, but in recent years he's published several books relating to the lives of both his parents. And these have included both republications of some of Ernie O'Malley's early memoirs, as well as newly discovered manuscripts and some of Ernie O'Malley's correspondence from his warring years and afterwards. He's also published The Men Will Talk to Me, a series of Ernie O'Malley's interviews with over 450 former comrades around Ireland. Most recently, he has also helped publish 2 volumes of his mother's photography, and among her subjects is the restoration of Kilmainham Gaol between 1936 and 76. Some of you may have seen the documentary that he produced about his parents' artistic life, A Call to Arts, which will be shown on RT later this year. And he's also made a series called Ernie's Journey, which appears on his website, ernieomalley.com. So, now that we have the introductions out of the way, I'm just going to start with you, Will, if that's okay. I was just wondering, could you give me a general sense of the political situation in Ireland at the time of the escape, and in particular how political imprisonment was being used by the British administration and army at that point in the War of Independence?
Well, I suppose, Brian, we're in a period here when the conflict between Dáil Éireann and the IRA, the separatist nationalists who are seeking to achieve Irish independence, their conflict with the British state has escalated quite rapidly through 1920, really, I suppose, the autumn of 1919, up until the spring of 1921. And the escalation is marked from the autumn of 1919 by the IRA beginning a campaign against, first of all, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and then later in early 1920 against the Royal Irish Constabulary across provincial Ireland. And the British state in Ireland responds to that by deploying various special constabulary forces, the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans very famously, but also using the military more widely during 1920 and into early 1921. And Ireland is becoming a much more violent place as a consequence of this conflict. We're all very familiar, I suppose, with Bloody Sunday and days like that, but maybe a very straightforward measure for us today might be to think about the 14th of February, the day of the escape, when 5 people were killed that day. 4 of them in Cork, two farmers' sons called the Coffees, who were taken out from their bed at night and shot by masked men. And it's assumed they were police who thought that these men were IRA members. And also 2 other men who were shot by the IRA suspected spies. And also there was a man called Dennis Quinlan in Tipperary, in Headford in Tipperary, who was shot dead when he failed to stop at a police checkpoint. So you can see the sort of febrile atmosphere there is in the country by February of 1921. In terms of imprisonment, well, one of the key markers of the escalation in terms of the state's repressive or coercive policies is the passing of the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act in August of 1920. And that had facilitated an escalation of the military involvement, and in particular, the use of court-martial. So in early 1920, between January and July 1920, there had been 94 court-martials in Ireland, but between August and December 1920, there were 809 court-martials. So you can see court-martials are being used far more often. And another form of imprisonment that's becoming very common in late 1921 is internment without trial, and that's really taking off from November 1920, when large camps are established in places like Ballykinlar and the Curragh and Spike Island and Bear Island. And by February, you have about 2,000 men who are being held in that kind of camp. I suppose just in terms of the court-martials, it's important to note that one of the penalties that could be imposed by those court-martials was the death sentence. And that became less theoretical and more a reality from the 1st of November 1920, when Kevin Barry becomes the first person executed since 1916. So there's a real threat of execution now if you're arrested and you're about to become before court-martial in Ireland in early 1921. And Kilmainham Gaol was reopened in December of 1920 to house men who were considered dangerous or were being held in advance of court-martial. And these included, obviously, Ernie O'Malley from late December, Frank Teeling from 1st of February, Simon Donnelly from the 11th of February, and Paddy Moran as well, who I'm sure we'll talk about as we go along.
That's great. So definitely you can sense, I suppose, kind of in terms of the energy in the country, things are really kind of heating up. Cormac, if I could just turn to you, could you just give us, I suppose, a brief sense of who your father, Ernie O'Malley, was at the time of this escape and how he found himself in Kilmainham Gaol?
Yeah, it wasn't a happy lot there, I must say. So my father was a medical student in 1916, and not particularly pro-Irish. His father was a civil servant. But on that day, he was down and he read the proclamation, and he went out and picked up a gun in a very individualistic manner, not having joined. A couple of months later, he joined the IRA in North Dublin, and while he continued at medical school, and after Ash's death and a couple of other incidents, in March 1918, he joined up and went over and was working under Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy. They sent him off around the country as an organizer, so to help brigades, and he was involved in places like Ballytrain and Hollyford, Rarecross, Drangan and Mallow, and then he was sent on another aspect by Richard Mulcahy to take over the new headquarters of the auxiliaries in Inistioge, County Kilkenny. And he was down there trying to get that job organized. And the Kilkenny people feel that he was very careless. And indeed, at the time of his arrest, he had loads of information and notebooks open on his desk. And his old spirit of trying to fight it out failed, because he was in fact captured, and his notebooks concerning the whereabouts of local people and their names were captured. So he was brought up to Dublin Castle in that early December, given a rough time, and was put into the same cell where Father Clancy and McKee and others had been killed just a couple of days before. He was given a good working over with hot pokers and bayonets and other things by the British intelligence officers. His name was at that point was Bernard Stewart, and he was so beaten up that he couldn't really be recognized. He was finally thrown out. They didn't get any information out of him, and they threw him out. He was pretty young. He was just turned 24, and they must have given up on him and threw him out to Kilmainham as a holding spot to see what was happening. So when he was in Kilmainham, he was still very much afraid because he could be identified. And, as Will had just mentioned, starting in November and after Bloody Sunday, all of the IRA were on tenterhooks as to what their actions might be for themselves and the consequences. So he was in a very difficult position when he was out there.
And in his vivid memoir, On Another Man's Wound, he gives a really, I suppose, kind of visceral account of what Kilmainham Jail was like at the time. Could you give us a sense of how he describes the jail?
Well, the jail was a pretty rundown place. As you mentioned, the British soldiers were stationed on the good side, and having just opened this old wing, they dumped the prisoners in the old wing. Now, the old wing meant that nothing much was running. It was pretty rusty. I'm sure it probably looked a little bit like the first time I saw Kilmainham back in the 1950s, when it hadn't been operated for many years. There was the walls were damp, the windows were open. He was thrown in there in January, pretty cold month, as you know, with open windows in Dublin. And one of the first things he wanted to do, of course, was figure out how to get out of there. So he and others, Paddy Moore and others, started to develop a plan of escape. But we can talk about that later.
Okay. And I suppose the other thing that's kind of very clear in the memoir is there's a real kind of sense of urgency about his need to escape. Can you explain why he felt it was so important to get out of the jail at that time?
Well, personally for him, if he were identified either as someone other than Bernard Stewart, or he tells this very telling story in On Another Man's Wound, when someone in the exercise yard says, "O'Malley! O'Malley!" And of course his name is Stewart. So he drops back, and he's recognized by this 19-year-old boy who had been in the Irish Volunteers in North Dublin and had first met Father in 1916. And so he quickly sort of said, "My name's Stewart now. Let's talk later." And so there is a real incident. And of course, there would have been guards around. Father's papers had been discovered along with Michael Collins' papers on December 31. And the British intelligence were viewing this new sort of inspiring organizer who had traveled through many counties and didn't know of his importance or existence previously. So they put two and two together. He certainly would have been up for rougher treatment. And also, given the issues of the recent Dan Barry's activities, and there was real concern for himself. A second important reason was he and Collins and Mulcahy had talked about the creation. The IRA was run in a brigade organizational sense. There were 65 brigades around Ireland. I mean, you can't run a ship like that. You need divisions. And so they came up with this idea of having 12 divisions. And at one point, before Father was captured, he was going to take care of what eventually was going to be the 1st and 2nd Division. That would have meant that he would have had 12 or 14,000 men under his control. By the time he got out, the leaders had said that was far too much. So Liam Lynch would get the 1st Division and Father would get the 2nd Division. So I think he was anxious not only for his own health, but to get back into the fight. So he had something to gain apart from saving his life.
Okay. And May, if I could move on to you then, I suppose in the same way, could you tell us a little bit about who your uncle Patrick Moran was, and again, how he found himself in Kilmainham Gaol at the time of this escape?
And Brian, he was born, as you say, in Crossna, near Boyle in County Roscommon. He trained as a grocer's assistant and worked in Boyle and then in Mohill and in Athy before joining John Doyle's staff at Doyle's Corner on the Phibsborough Road. Now, while he was there, he immersed himself in labour activities and in the Gaelic League and the GAA. He was around for the 1913 lockout. He was active in that. He played football for the Grocers' Assistants and he played for Marlborough Rangers. And later on, he established a team in Dunleary. And that team was called Dunleary Commercials, and they actually played in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday earlier than the main match. He was also involved in the IRB. Sean Farrelly, who owned the pub and who had something to do with the escape as well. He was one of the pubs where the soldiers used to come. He took him into the IRB. And of course, when the Volunteers were formed in 1914, he became a member of the Irish Volunteers. And at that time, he trained other volunteers along with Martin Savage. So he was involved very early on in the movement. He was, by the time 1916 came around, he was adjutant of D Company, Dublin 2 Brigade. And in 1916, he fought in Jacob's factory. He was deported to Knutsford. He spent most of his time in Knutsford near Manchester. And then in the last 2 weeks before he was released, he was in Francock in the same hut, same side. There was a north camp and a south camp, and he was in the north camp with Michael Collins. He returned home in 1916. He was released in August 1916. And then he went to work in Dunleary. He worked in Lynch and O'Brien's in Dunleary. That premises is now owned by Shaw's. And it's thought that he was strategically placed in Dunleary so that he could watch the port, watch people coming in and so on. He continued his activities with the GAA, of course, and he continued with his union. He had been a member of the Grocers' Assistants, and that union amalgamated with the Barmen's Union. And he was a founder member of the Barmen's Union and was the national president, actually, at the time of his death. He also continued his activities with D Company, and he became a captain of D Company in 1919. Now, how did he come to be in Kilmainham? Well, in the roundup that followed Bloody Sunday, when, a lot of the people, papers had been taken from O'Malley's house when it was raided, not O'Malley, from Mulcahy's house when it was raided. And a lot of those people were rounded up after Bloody Sunday. And he was arrested at his place of work on the Friday following Bloody Sunday. And he was taken to the Bridewell. Now, he was in the Bridewell for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, he was subjected to 2 identification parades. And he wasn't picked out at either of those parades. But he was later transferred to Arbour Hill. And in Arbour Hill, again, he was subjected to 2 identification parades. And the second one was really a setup, as he described it afterwards for his solicitor, how he was placed between the same 2 people each time, and 2 officers at the window prompting each other on who should be picked out and so on. And they asked for him to be shaved, and he went away and was shaved. And then he was the only man in the group that was clean shaven at that stage, so it was easy to pick him out. And then he was transferred to Kilmainham in late December, well, around the 17th of December. And he was told that he was going to be subjected to another identification parade. Well, that parade didn't happen until January. But again, he was picked out from 7 people, but he was strategically placed between the same 2 people as before. And of course, it was easy to pick him out. So that's how he found himself in Kilmainham.
And can I just ask then about one of the other members of the escape party? Because I know you've kind of looked at them all as part of your research.
Yeah.
Uncle's story. Can you tell us a bit about Frank Teeling?
Well, Frank Teeling was a Dubliner. He was born in inner Dublin, lived near Seville Place. He was a young, he joined the Volunteers in 1918 because he too was a footballer. He was involved in the GAA. And of course, a lot of the people who were involved in the Volunteers were involved in the GAA, the Gaelic League, and so on. And he played football with O'Toole's GAA club. He worked in an ironworks in Inchicore. He belonged to E Company of the 2nd Battalion. And he was recognised early on as a sharpshooter. And he was one of 3 people that were chosen to help out in a proposed rescue of Kevin Barry from Mountjoy. And he was to shoot the guard at the gate if necessary. But the plan to get Kevin Barry out fell through at the last minute. And that was that. He was arrested on Bloody Sunday because he was detailed to take care of one of the intelligence officers who lived at 22 Lower Mount Street, a man named Peel. Well, Angus and Peel lived in 22 Lower Mount Street, and Angus was shot dead, but Frank Teeling was involved with trying to shoot Peel, and Lieutenant Peel, barricaded himself into his room with the furniture in the room. And as it happened, a lorry load of auxiliaries were passing through Mount Street, and they came on 22 Lower Mount Street and the activity that was going on there. And Frank tried to escape out the back, and he was covering for 2 other volunteers who were getting over the wall with them. He was covering them, and he got shot in the hip and was injured. And actually his life was saved there and then, because as it happened, General Crozier came along, and one of the auxiliaries had a gun to Frank's head. And General Crozier said to him, "Why are you going to shoot him? You already have him. Take him to hospital and let him be tried later." So he was saved on that occasion as well, and he was taken to George V Hospital, and he was there for 2 weeks, and eventually then was taken to Mountjoy and eventually to Kilmainham Gaol. But he was only 21 years of age at that stage. He was a very young man.
Yeah, but they were all
very, yeah, they were all around. But he was very popular man, very popular with the wardens as well as with the prisoners. And of course, because he was caught red-handed, it was very urgent that he be got out of Kilmainham.
Yeah, that kind of the personal connection thing, I think, with the guards is kind of crucial in terms of the
yes.
So, Cormac, if I just go back to you, then obviously there's a last-minute addition to the escape party, Simon Donnelly. Can you tell us kind of briefly about him, about who he was?
Sure, yeah. Well, now, Simon was in fact older than the other fellows. He was born in 91, so he would have been 30 in 1921. but he had been joined the Irish Volunteers. He was active in 1916. He was over at Boland's Mill with De Valera. He had been the OC of a C Company under De Valera on that occasion. He later, continued his activities with the IRA, and there's an interesting story in Another Man's Own when Captain Donnelly meets Lieutenant O'Malley, who is really a greenhorn sent up by Collins to help drill the people, do activities in Tyrone. And Donnelly has sympathy with this O'Malley, who is quite incompetent in handling men, and gives him some tips as to how to parade a company, and watched him and encouraged him. Anyway, after that, he returned to Dublin and eventually becomes vice commandant of the 3rd Battalion in Dublin, Dublin 1 Brigade, for the rest of the War of Independence. He was arrested on February 10, 1921, and placed into Kilmainham. Given his position and his activities before then, when word got to Collins certainly wanted to make sure that men like Teeling and Donnelly and O'Malley were all gotten out of the jail, and so he was asked to join in. Another advantage of Donnelly was that he was a local, since that these were curfew days or nights, as Will Murphy mentioned, and so you needed somebody to get around. And having the advantage of somebody who had local knowledge of the area around Kilmainham was very helpful. So that was really why he joined in.
Yeah, and as you mentioned on Another Man's Wound, can you, I suppose, if we can move on maybe to the escape itself, can you talk us through how Ernie O'Malley described the escape and the events of the 14th of February?
Sure. Well, a plan was set in motion and it took a couple of weeks to get going. Paddy Moran was very helpful and in communications. The word got out that, of course, that Ernie was there, and that a plan needed to be developed. Paddy and Ernie had sent diagrams out, and the key to all of this really was the fact that through intelligence circles in Dublin, they were able to meet two of the Welsh Guards, Private Ernest Roper and Private J. Holland of the 2nd Battalion of the Welsh Guards. So they were sympathetic, and perhaps other circumstances assisted their sympathy. But the point is, they were, as young men, Welsh Guards putting their life on the line, and perhaps if caught, as they were later, they too could be executed or something happened to them. Anyway, they were the go-between between Father and others, no doubt, sending messages in and out. And one of the things that the plan developed was that they wanted to have how would they do it? Well, there was a big bolt, and after their inspection, they needed bolt cutters to cut the big bolt in order to get out the door of the gate. Of course, they had no idea what was on the other side of the gate, whether there was another bolt that they needed to get. But the first thing was the big bolt. So the Welsh Guards brought in these two big bolt cutters. They must have been and they were disassembled, so that when within the jail, the two pieces were put together. And these are now over in the museum, the National Museum of Ireland, and can be seen. So during Father had a difficult time, because whenever they had to go out on exercise, the guards would come in and check the cells. So, of course, he had to strap the bolt cutters to his legs and in his cuffs as he walked around. Of course, he couldn't run because they might fall out. The other present that was sent in, brought in by the guards, was a revolver. So again, he had to carry a revolver, which would have meant certain death if he had been caught with that, I'm sure, as he went out in the yard. So they developed a plan, which would be, they'd go down, cut the bolts, and out they'd go. Well, the first time that they tried that, it failed. So the lads from the 4th Battalion Dublin were on the outside, and Father tells a beautiful story as to, the excitement build up. You get down, you go down the passageways, you get out into the yard, and you try with the bolt cutters. Oh, God damn it, what the hell, And so, they can't do it. So, hey, we can't do it. Okay, we'll throw over the ladder. So they throw the ladder over the wall, and they're trying to pull the ladder down, and it gets stuck. And they give it a big heave, and it breaks. So they have to go back up to almost certain death, under certain circumstances. This happens 4 times in a row. Now, in between times, and I should say, this story has been written up included in the More Escapes by Eric Williams many years ago as one of the great escapes, along with Count of Monte Cristo and all of that. And they happened to take my father's version of it from On Another Man's Wound, but it's sort of published worldwide now as an escape plot. Anyway, so what happens is they go back down another time, try to cut the lock. It won't. So Father sort of is very discouraged. He complains to the Welsh guards, and one of the guards feels that he has let the team down. So he and Donnelly go down, and I don't know how they do this, and Father doesn't describe it. I presume it's sort of in the evening, twilight downs. Now, 4 o'clock in the evening, Dublin in February, it's pretty dark. But they go down and they cut the bolt. And they come back up and sort of say, we've done it, Oh my God, it's ready to go. So that night again, they try to do it. And one of the soldiers walks by and it has to be scuttled, and they come back into their cells. And then finally on the night of, according to Father's story, Paddy Moran is willing to go on each of these occasions. But whatever happens, and I'm not sure of what May's version of this might be, on the night of the 14th, Paddy Moran has changed his attitude and decides, look, I'm going to take a risk. I'm innocent of what is charged, and I'm sure I'll get off, and I'd rather not have a criminal record, or whatever, however the story went. Anyway, so he stayed in, and Teeling and Connolly, Simon Donnelly and Ernie O'Malley go down the final tie on the to the open door, open bolt, pull it open, and of course he has a revolver in his hand, and as he sticks his head out, who does he see but another British soldier? And he said, oh my God, we're going to have to fight our way. What has gone wrong with the plan? And then the soldier turns around just a little bit, and he sees a skirt or something to suggest that there's a female in the soldier's arms. So he whispers to the other guys, "You go along that way. I'll cover you." And he goes off and gets on the tram and is freed. I mean, and it's a beautifully narrated story. As I say, and they were out. Now, thanks to the 4th Battalion engineers who were involved and on the guard on the outside, doing a lot of the brushwork and preparation, and I'm sure they would have taken care of any of the British soldiers had it been a difficult situation. But anyway, that's the story.
So one of the things I find so fascinating about this story is the number of different versions that exist. I think you really know that a story has entered a kind of a legendary status when different versions emerge. And I know, May, in your book, you kind of looked at these kind of different and sometimes kind of contradictory versions of the escape as well, from lots of people, some of whom were involved and some of whom were on the outside. Can you tell us about
I did, Brian, I did. Well, as you say, the Kilmainham Gaol was in the 4th Battalion area, and the 4th Battalion was responsible for getting the men away, if you like. So there are a lot of statements both witness statements and notes that were given to Ernie O'Malley from members of the 4th Battalion. And they talk about, having 10 people ready for a whole week who had to, before curfew, go and hide in a hay shed and then come back up towards Kilmainham Gaol to make sure that they were there if the escape happened on any given night. So they describe all that. And then there are others who say that they acted like as corporation workers, and that they bought sweeping brushes and that they were sweeping outside the jail at 7 o'clock in the morning and at 7 o'clock in the evening, because that was the time of the changing of the guard, and that was the times that they thought that they would be able, most likely, to be trying to get away. Now, some say in those statements that there were 2 attempts, that they were a week apart, that there were 3 attempts, one night, one a week later, at the one that failed, the bolt cutter failed, and then the following night they succeeded. Some say the rope ladder was tried first and the bolt cutter afterwards. Oscar Traynor also says that. Oscar Traynor was charged with organising the escape, and he says that the rope ladder was tried first and then that the bolt cutters was tried. But the most telling one, I think, that I read was Seamus Kerwin, who owned, or Jim Kerwin as he was sometimes called. He owned the pub in Parnell Street, where most of the arrangements were made. And he was a member of D Company. Paddy Moran would be his captain, and they were very good friends. And he wrote a letter in 1932 in response to Simon Donnelly's version of the escape, which had been published in the paper, and Sean Farrelly's account also. And Seamus Kerwin wrote a letter, and he said that the escape, the first day he heard of it was when Herbie Conroy, who was a prisoner in Kilmainham, had come out because a relative had died and he was allowed out for a few days. And he had come to Kerwin's pub and he had said that they could, that he thought that it could be arranged, that an escape could happen from Kilmainham. And that was in December. Now, he said that he immediately told Oscar Traynor, and that Sean Russell and Oscar Traynor were making arrangements at that stage, but that nothing happened. But then in January, he had a visit from one of those soldiers, Paddy Holland, and he said that he thought that an escape could be arranged. He brought with him a note from Paddy Moran, and he was asking for help from outside. And Seamus Kerwin gave that note to Michael Collins, and Michael Collins sent back a note saying that everything would be done to assist them to escape. So there were several attempts made, according to him, and he said he saw the soldiers almost daily at that stage, and that he brought them to meet Michael Collins in his own house, and that a lot of the meetings took place in his own house. And he said that when the rope failed, that the 2 soldiers suggested that a bolt cutter be procured, because there was a rusty gate at the back that was never used, and that they thought that the lock could be taken off it with a bolt cutter. So Mike Smith, who was a fellow member of Frank Teeling's company and worked in Breen's garage in Donnybrook, made the bolt cutter. And he made it with handles that could be taken off. And then Seamus Kerwin says that the 2 soldiers came and said that they would bring the bolt cutter into the prison, and that they brought it and the revolver just on the Sunday before the escape. And he says that that was the last time that he saw the soldiers. Now, that whole story was told again in 1956 when Anna Kelly wrote 2 articles in the Sunday Press. She was a secretary to Michael Collins working out of 6 Harcourt Street. So she said that she told the same story. Paddy Moran had said that only 2 or 3 could safely go 2 or at most 3. And Harry Colley, in his witness statement, says that the order was imposed from headquarters, and that they said that Frank Teeling, because he was under sentence of death, he had been tried on the 25th of January and found guilty, of course, and he was under sentence of death, so he was to be the first man out. Ernie O'Malley, who was under the name Bernard Stewart, as Cormac has said, would be the second man out, and Paddy Moran would be the third. But in the event, as we know, on the night of the 14th, it was Simon Donnelly who was third man out.
So, as you mentioned there, Patrick Moran at the last, I suppose, minute decides to stay behind. Mm-hmm. So, from your research, and I suppose the family stories as well, why do you think he made that decision, and what I suppose if you could also tell us the consequences of that decision for him?
Well, yes, I could, but he talked about that himself. Like he told his brother on the night before he was hanged. He told his brother that Ernie O'Malley's had been moved into a cell just across from him, and that the proximity of his cell to that of Ernie O'Malley's would mean that it was going to be very hard for Ernie O'Malley to get away, for the two of them to get away. That was one of the things he said. He did say that he didn't want to let down the witnesses. And this is where the differences of the dates come in, because as Cormac has said, Paddy Moran was with them, at least on the first night. Now on the 14th, that was the night before his trial was due to begin. So it would seem to me that I would think that the first attempt happened a week or so before, and that he was maybe prepared to go at that stage, but that he would look guilty. He said if they were found, if when they escaped, he would definitely look guilty and he would definitely face execution. He also said that he might have another chance, but he also believed that he had a cast iron alibi. And his solicitor said that the reason that he told him that he didn't escape was that he felt he had a cast iron alibi and that he wouldn't stand in the way of somebody else getting away. So, I'd have to ask the question, did he give his place to Simon Donnelly? Because Simon Donnelly was a much wanted man also when they would come to know who he was. And he was only in on the Friday before the escape. He only came to Kilmainham on the Friday. So he wouldn't have been there if the first attempt was a week before. But that's in dispute. I don't know whether that is the case or not. Now, Paddy had written down the whole identification parade saga because, he really was set up to be identified in the identification. And Snelling, Private Snelling, was the soldier cyclist who identified him. And his evidence wasn't accepted in the cases of Boyce and McNamara and Whelan and Tobin. His evidence wasn't accepted. So he could reasonably have thought that his evidence wouldn't be accepted in his case either. The other thing, he had 18 witnesses, and one of them was actually a DMP policeman. So he felt that one of their own wasn't going to be ignored as well. What he didn't know at that stage was that the police had asked the two lads who stayed with them in Blackrock, and that he was, at the time of his arrest, he was working in McGee's. He had just changed a couple of months beforehand to McGee's of Blackrock. And there was two lads with them, Doyle and McCourt. Now they had been rounded up as well, and they were in Ballykindler. And he didn't know that they had given a different alibi for him. Now, the 18 witnesses were gathered together by Peg Flanagan, who knew Paddy in Blackrock and was a member of Kilmainham. And she obviously didn't know that those lads, they were gone to Ballykindler. She didn't know that they were interviewed at all. They had never been told what the alibi was. So they gave a different alibi. And the other thing that was produced at his trial was a photograph of him with the gun. Now, neither of the two things were allowed in evidence, but the fact that they were mentioned at all meant that, you know, the case kind of collapsed at the last minute. But he didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of the great what ifs of Irish history. He had escaped execution.
Well, he said eventually, I needn't have. He also said that he might have another chance to escape.
Yeah.
And he actually did have another chance, in a sense, but he wouldn't accept it. Paddy McGrath, who later worked for the Irish Press, went into Mountjoy just before his execution, and he tried to swap places with him. He offered to swap places with him, but of course he wouldn't accept that because he felt that Paddy McGrath would then pay with his life, and he wouldn't do that either. But Tommy Whelan was in Kilmainham with them, and Tommy Whelan was definitely not, he wasn't out at all on Bloody Sunday. Now, Paddy Moran was not in Mount Street, of course, but we now know that he was in the Gresham. But Tommy Whelan wasn't anywhere, and he was found guilty, and yet he didn't come into the equation at all for escaping, which I find extraordinary, really.
Cormac, if I could just return to you, just in terms of, you know, you were talking about that they escaped. So I suppose what happens to Teeling, O'Malley, and Donnelly in the aftermath of this escape? What did they do?
Yeah, well, so Simon was has a long sort of quasi-political life in Irish affairs. He gets out of prison. He's involved in the IRA police. He's in the Four Courts with my father. He's later captured, and he's in Mountjoy. He goes on a hunger strike, and when the hunger strike of October 23, he and the 58 others, including Ernie and all of the newly elected TDs, were transferred to Kilmainham. So he's back in Kilmainham. When he gets out finally, after the internment in the Curragh, etc., he still remains a very strong nationalist in the Sinn Féin line. He creates the National Association of the Old IRA as sort of a unit. I remember as a child hearing about these fellows. They were comrades trying to breach the gap between those who had been pro-treaty and anti-treaty, and they said, let's get together, and they would do annual reunions and things like that, trying to build the bridge. He also was a member of the National Executive of the Republican Prisoners Association. Again, this was a historic association of all of those lads who had been prisoners. And he was, in 1940, he was a founding member of Chorus na Publica and its president, and in 1946 a founding member of Clan na Publica, which would have been, you know, a split off from the other two parties, and of which people like Sean McBride became the Foreign Affairs Minister. And, you know, he retired happily into that sort of life. He was there for 1916 for the 50th anniversary, and he died in 1966. Paddy Teeling had a different and sadder life when he got out. After the treaty debates, etc., he went pro-treaty and joined up as one of the big issues in those days was whether you get a job or not and how you could afford to survive. So he got the pay from being a soldier in the National Army, but he was involved in two sort of murder, let's call it gunning incidents, in which he killed one person and seriously injured another person. So he he was court-martialed, and later on in life he had another incident, which again, he was a pretty, I would sort of understand, to be a relatively depressed chap for the rest of his life. He had a drinking problem, and he was imprisoned once or twice, and also in 1931. And he died, from what I understand, not a very happy life in 1976. My father, all of these lads suffer this post-traumatic syndrome. I mean, when they had been doing this stuff for 6-8 years, it really takes a toll on you. And it took a big toll on my father, as well as many of the others. So one of the things, because of the poor health of my father, when he got out of the Curragh in 24, he he was advised that he should go, and he got some money from the White Cross and from some friends to go to Europe, go to Southern Europe and get some sun, rest and relax. He wasn't exactly that type of person, so he started into a culture plan to visit all the cities and churches and monasteries and things like that. Basically, he took 10 years of his life in travels and went to America. De Valera was trying to raise funds to create a new, he had founded Fianna Fáil by that time. Father did not join Fianna Fáil, he remained a Sinn Féiner, but he and Aiken went to America and in 28, and he stayed on for about 7 years. So, in fact, I was just thinking, as May told about her version, or the other versions of Father's story. Father's memoirs was written on the plains of New Mexico, had no research materials. And I mean, one of the nice things about the book is it's quite lyrical, it flows well, there are major gaps in it. Well, the major gaps relate to how modernist writers write, so he fell into that category. You don't need to know about that. You want to know about the Irish story of how we fought, not on all its details, but how Cuchulainn did it, and so facts, I'm not saying he was wrong on facts, or let's say he was a little bit loose, not intentionally, but he had no facts before him. Had he written on another man's wound, or if I were to rewrite on another man's wound, with the knowledge that we now have after he interviewed his comrades in the 1950s, it would be quite a different book with different credits, but it wouldn't have the same flavor that he had. Anyway, so he meets my mother, who's an American artist, in the 1930s, and they marry, come back to Ireland. And basically, he disassociates himself from politics and what was going on in the political world. He was asked by De Valera to run, but he couldn't. He never really joined Fianna Fáil, and so he went into the arts, and so he became a literary character. He published the 2 books. He got stuck with a lawsuit, so that took him out of writing anything more in Ireland. But he became a literary editor in the Bell. He helped Jack Yates do the one-man show in the arts. He befriended a lot of artists in the 1940s, involved with the establishing the Irish Exhibition of Living Art in 1943. And my mother, as a modernist sculptor, had her art in there, as a whole cadre of Louis Le Brocq, Jack Yates, and other people who felt that the Royal Academy was not the place for them to be exhibited. Anyway, he was always in very bad health. He had heart attacks, but he had good friends. When John Ford came to Ireland, Father was on the scene of The Quiet Man and the other movie in 1956. So, he had an interesting rest of his life, but he died in poor health. And an interesting little factor is he was given a state funeral. Why was Ernie O'Malley given a state funeral? The only people before that were presidents of Ireland, or an archbishop or something. Mm-hmm. Ernie O'Malley had no status in Ireland, and yet he was given a state funeral. Well, that was, Fianna Fáil had wanted to do right by their man, so to speak, and I think it was just a very nice token. A lot of other leaders were no longer alive or whatever, and so they did him honors with a state funeral in 1957 when he died.
Yeah, it is kind of remarkable, these kind of different lives that the three men who escaped lived, and also, as you mentioned, I suppose the effect that the conflict had upon them. I suppose one of the things you think about as well is that it's a period when it's not really possible for them maybe to talk about what happened to them, and maybe get in some cases you think maybe get the kind of help that some of them probably needed. So I suppose just to finish up, I was just going to return to Will and just ask you. Obviously, we've heard about this very dramatic escape. What were the immediate consequences of the escape, both for those running Kilmainham Gaol, and also did it have an effect, kind of a wider effect, on how military and political prisons were operating for the rest of the War of Independence?
Well, I suppose one of the most striking things immediately is, the panic and confusion inside Kilmainham Gaol when they realize that, these three guys are gone. So there's the immediate attempt to try and see if they can be recaptured, and there's bringing in of bloodhounds, etc., and see if they can be tracked down. And there's a very great awareness this is going to be deeply embarrassing. Kieran McAvoy, who's written about, political prisoners, and he's written about the various ways in which they can protest and they can resist and they can hunger strike. But he said one of the very effective ways they can do is resist through ridicule. So effectively make their captors look ridiculous by escaping. Okay, so that's one of the, I suppose, immediate impacts. Then there's an investigation straight away. And the questioning starts. Immediately there are 15 soldiers who were arrested and questioned, and quite quickly there's an investigation held on the day after and the succeeding day, and it goes on for a number of days after that. And then the number of suspects narrows down, first to 6, to 2 officers and 4 soldiers, and eventually really it narrows down to two soldiers that Cormac mentioned as he was talking earlier, to Ernst Roper and James Holland. Roper, I suppose, is an obvious person to suspect because he was the soldier in charge of the landing in B Wing, the middle landing in B Wing that night. It would have been very difficult for the prisoners to escape without his knowledge, and there have been locks, removed, which he's the most likely candidate to have done that, etc. So very quickly he's suspected, and I suppose he's also suspected because it emerges that he has established a relationship with some of the previous prisoners. I think you hinted at this, that this might be a factor, Brian, earlier when the conversation was going on. So, for instance, when they search, they find that he has been sent letters by Father Dominic, who was a priest who was very friendly with prisoners, thanking him for his kindness to prisoners, by J.J. Kavanagh, who was an ex-prisoner who'd been released, etc. So immediately Roper is suspected, and then James Holland was his partner, who was supposed to be in charge of that landing as well. In fact, on the night he was in charge of the landing below, the sort of bottom landing, and that was because 3 prisoners had been introduced into the prison reasonably recently, and they had to be looked after as well. And on the particular night, Holland was looking after them. But so the case looks a bit weaker against Holland as far as the authorities are concerned, but they still, center in on him. And I think part of that is because he's Irish. One of the officers, Major General Boyd, in correspondence, said of him, he is an Irishman, Protestant, and Belfast, it is true, but still Irish and of a particularly low type. Okay, so there's a suspicion of, and there's another soldier called Kavanagh who's suspected as well because he might have a slight hint of an Irish accent. His parentage might be Irish. Okay, so anyway, it settles on the 2 of those, and they would be prosecuted and court-martialed in April, and they're given sentences of 8 years penal servitude. They won't serve those out. In 1922, after the conflict has ended, they will be released, and this is for, a lot of some of the IRA prisoners who are still held in 1922, etc., are being released at the same time. So there's a sort of a general sense that those who are being held as a consequence of the conflict are being released, and it's probably not a surprise that they too are released. Although a dimmer view is taken of soldiers who have crossed the line during this period, if that makes sense. As far as the general officers in charge of the jail, the more senior officers in Dublin tend to exonerate them. For instance, there's an R.W. May who's in charge of the prison, and he's seen as being perhaps somewhat negligent, but not directly responsible. There's a sense that there were two problems here really that were difficult to overcome. First of all, there were soldiers who weren't professional prison warders who were trying to manage the situation, and this was a problem which is likely to lead to escape. And the other thing was they recognized that they had failed to patrol the perimeter of the prison and effectively, and this was probably a significant problem in terms of the escape. So as a consequence, they decided they're going to move prisoners out of Kilmainham. And most of them are moved to Mountjoy. There's an order to move 24 men to Mountjoy out of Kilmainham on the 16th of February. And there may have been some men who were moved in the day or two before that. And one of the effects of that is to move this group of prisoners into the city centre. And that will have an effect when the time comes around, when the court martials will be completed and executions are to be held. You now have executions happening in a city centre location. And that facilitates, the gathering of crowds and the organising of protests around the executions. And it creates a certain kind of atmosphere in the city centre when the executions will come in the first instance in March. But then there are later executions again in April and in June. So I think that's significant in terms of the sort of, the prisons obviously have a fixed physical footprint in the city, but I think the psychological footprint that the prison has inside the city sort of expands around execution, if that makes sense. And the fact that it's happening in the city centre matters. So generally speaking, there's a hope that Mountjoy has got, he's got warders who are professionals. It's more heavily fortified, that this will make it safer. And it is to some extent, although once we come to the truce period, there are regular escapes out of the other prisons as well, out of Mountjoy, out of Kilkenny prison. There are escapes out of the internment camps. So, shutting down Kilmainham doesn't solve the problem of escapes. And that issue of the authorities looking incompetent and seeming ridiculous will continue right through to the end of the conflict, into the truce period as well.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that when Kilmainham is used later on, particularly after the Customs House as a prison, they use it just as a prison. It's no longer going to have this kind of strange dual function of soldiers in one side and prisoners in the other. It's I think that the embarrassment is very evident in the inquiry papers, and the need to cover things up as well, I think, or gloss over failures in terms of how the prison operates.
Absolutely. And one of the things they've done in Kilmainham is they have repeated a mistake which they've made a number of times, which is to bring groups. They identify groups of men who they perceive as elite, and they think they need to quarantine them away and put them together. But so they're quarantining from other people. But actually, one of the effects that has is you gather them together and they plan, and that has consequences. And the authorities seem to make this mistake over and over again. They can't make up their mind whether it's worse to quarantine them away and hold them together, or whether it's worse to allow them among the other men and cause trouble, inside the more general population of prisoners, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. When you think about, they're 4 brilliant men, and very skilled at what they do, and bringing them all together. It's kind of nearly a recipe for disaster. So anyway, I think we'll kind of draw things to a close now. I suppose the last thing I wanted to mention, I work in Kilmainham Gaol. I'm the curator of collections there, and obviously how we're commemorating the escape isn't quite how we planned it maybe over a year ago. But one of the things that we are excited about is a project that was in place before the current situation, was the restoration of the original gates through which the men escaped on the 14th of February. The gates were taken down in the early 90s. They'd kind of reached a point where they were no longer usable as working gates. So currently they are being conserved, and albeit a little bit delayed, we hope to have them back in Kilmainham Gaol, where they'll no longer be working gates, but will actually join the Kilmainham Gaol collection. So they'll be, I think, probably certainly if not our tallest object, certainly our heaviest. But I think it'll be wonderful to have them as well, because it is a story that really over the years has captured people's imagination. And even when listening to all of you describe the different aspects of the escape tonight, there's something incredibly almost cinematic about this story and about the subterfuge. It's, it has, as I said, it reminds you of all those kind of films like The Great Escape and Where Eagles Dare, and all the, the stress and the last minute changes and as we'll also point it out as well, the embarrassment caused to those in power. So it just remains for me then just to thank our three speakers, to thank May Moran, Cormac O'Malley and Will Murphy. And hopefully we'll be able to welcome people back to Kilmainham in person after soon enough, where they'll be able to hear once again the story of the escape in 1921. So thank you very much.